Hello, and I have a question. What role should the sciences play in determining what's human nature and what's not? And even more important, which science, right? A lot of us look to biology to determine what is true about humans, but why? Why should we care so much about whether our hormones or our endorphins make us think things or not? Clearly, humans can transcend those. Otherwise, a lot of people would be in jail or in bad situations because they couldn't ignore what their hormones or impulses were telling them, right? So why do we tend to put so much weight on what they used to be or not or things like that, right? So the same is true for anthropology and sociology and psychology. Other sciences that have different methods, why should their perspectives be centered in what we understand about humans, right? So, can the sciences really give us a solid foundation of what it means to be human? And do they have limits, right? In the case of in Native Americans and Deloria Jr., they certainly do, right? He's one of the people that argues that politics is not separated from science, especially when Native Americans are concerned. But his views align with Black philosophy, feminist philosophy, and lots of other perspectives at that time who were saying, hey, we don't like a lot of this stuff going on that's claiming to be objective, right? And there are some real issues for the human sciences. Psychology, for instance, you may not know this, but most psychological studies are done on college students because college students are easily accessible. They have a lot of free time, and they're adults who can consent, right? So, a lot of psychological research that says humans are like this or humans are more likely to do this, it's based off of a very narrow spectrum of people, which is largely American, European college students, right? So, by what means can we extrapolate what the rest of the world is like? So, I hope that in the course of your reading Deloria Jr.'s text, I want you to kind of reflect on 2 points. One is the indigenous perspectives on what it means to be human and to be a scientific subject. And also, what do you feel is the actual role of the sciences in determining what's good for humans or not? Because this is precisely what's being debated right now, right? It's one of the big tensions is do we accept certain biblical traditional views of what humans are, or do we accept what certain scientific perspectives say? And right now we're having a big political clash about it because we haven't really resolved it or set a good groundwork for it prior to this moment where it's become a crisis, right? A crisis doesn't mean something's bad per se. Something can be bad and not be a crisis. A crisis means that you have to make a choice. Crisis shares the root with the word, same with the word criteria, right? It's just something where you have to make a choice and you can't avoid it, right? In a certain sense, we kind of been trying to balance out where, okay, well, you live in your own space and you kind of have your own rules. You accept the authority, the truth, the knowledge you want, and we'll accept ours over here. But now we're reaching a crisis, right? Where we have to choose. One dimension of this crisis is being seen in our election that's upcoming, but it's also in other areas too. But there's a lot of tension as well as the crisis, right? And so with the work of Von Deloria Jr., we can see that how this crisis is something that indigenous people have been wrestling with for a long time. And perhaps there's some insight into our contemporary times in reading how they've navigated these issues. And also to understand how indigenous people have understood their relationship to government and their relationship towards themselves and their move for autonomy, right? And so the book that you read the chapter from, Anthropology and Other Friends, is called Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto. And that title says a lot, right? This book comes out in the 60s, and the idea that Custer died for your sins. Who's the your in that title? The your is Native American people. And Custer is a U.S. Army general who famously lost the war of the Battle of Little Bighorn in the Montana Territory. He was a leader of the United States' army against a coalition of indigenous peoples, and he lost. And so the idea that he died for your sins is playing upon the idea that indigenous people are backward, they're non Christian, they haven't modernized, they're not civilized, and we're dying for you, we're suffering for you, we're tolerating you, we're doing all these things to help modernize you and bring you into what it means to properly be human. We can't respect you, we have to save you, right? So it's commenting on this missionary attitude. This is why I had to start reading with the race making chapter, because I want to draw attention to where race comes from and how race plays out in this and the foundations of it, because the discourses about humans and what it means to be human are shaped by the politics going on in Spain and England and the United States during this time. Well, not the United States, but the American continent during this time, and it builds from there, right? When the Europeans and indigenous people met, it wasn't just political or cultural differences. There also were fundamental differences about being human. We saw it in the debates with La Casas and the Sepulveda, which are Native American people human or not? They're so different than us. They're not mentioned by our holy text or anything, right? Well, the Lakota people and other indigenous people had the same debates. Like, are these European people fully human or not? Right? Because for a lot of indigenous people, they didn't understand why Europeans were so driven to build fences and cut down stuff, and like why they had difficult. They seemed like they didn't have difficulty living in a certain kind of harmony, right? Different nations had different perspectives on this, right? So you see conflicting views about what it means to be a human. And part of Von Deloria Jr.'s perspective is that, hey, we lost those battles, and now we're struggling under someone else's definition of what it means to be a human, and we kind of got to start establishing our own if we're going to be successful. So I hope that this chapter helps you see the political and social significance of questions about human nature, right? Defining what it means to be a human, defining where your values and purpose are, defining what the goal is for you as a human being and a collective group is incredibly important. If someone defines it for you, you might be in serious trouble, right? As Von Deloria Jr. talks about. Now, aside from the part of Custer died for your sins, the second part is an Indian manifesto. A manifesto is a political document. It's a statement of political stances, right? You might have heard of the Communist Manifesto, right? A manifesto is a particular kind of political document. And so for him to say it's an Indian manifesto means that this whole book, you can read this and you can hold this up as a set of policies or political orientation towards the world and others, what kind of action you want to do, right? And this book is a part of a broader, emerges as a part of a broader awakening among a lot of Native American peoples called the American Indian Movement, or AIM for short. It was inspired a lot by the civil rights movement, the changes in the second wave, feminism, right? The 60s brought a lot of different changes. The Chicano movement, which we'll talk about a lot more later next week. But all these different groups of people started saying, hey, we have our own perspective. We have our own needs. We have our own political things we have to activate for. We need to change the country, right? We need to get politically serious. In the case of the American Indian movement, just like the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, right, that comes around the time the American Indian movement is emerging, we might even have to defend ourselves with weapons, right? I mean, living on reservations is not easy, right? It's only really recent there's been good protections, but during that time, if an American citizen come and did something on these reservations, there was no way the courts could hold that person accountable, right? In fact, in Canada, United States, Native American women are still the highest amount of like disappearing people who are not found, percentage-wise compared to their populations, right? So there's a lot of threat involved, right? So a lot of people started saying we need to organize, right? And also, as indigenous people, we need to work together. We need to reach across the line and figure out who we are, right? Do we have to be so silent in our own particular tribes? Maybe we can learn a lot from other people. Maybe what's going on for the indigenous people in New York is relevant to me in Arizona, right? That's a consciousness that the people had to come to, right? Because the United States is a huge continent, right? Hawaii is a huge. It's a huge spanning continent. All these from the tip to tip. And so a lot of those peoples traditionally didn't see themselves as having anything in common, right? That'll be like taking someone in Iran and someone in China and saying, okay, because you're both on the same continent, you should work together. Not necessarily. People traditionally in Washington didn't necessarily identify with people traditionally in Florida. That's a huge difference in space and culture. We think of America as much flatter than it is because we've grown up with it in the notion of highways and planes, and America has a very flat sense of space, right? We don't think of distances that as that big, right? But prior to the development of the United States, those are massive distances, right? People in Washington state, region, they didn't talk much with people in Florida, right? What we now call Florida. Those are, as like I said, as different as people in Greece and Kazakhstan, right? Culturally and politically. But starting with the 60s, there started to become this notion that no, the what was called the American Indian, Native American, there's we need to create a common language, create a sense of a common purpose. Not exactly, not to say we're exactly the same, of course, we have our very strong differences, but we need to reinvent ourselves and become more politically active and start to see ourselves as perhaps maybe having more in common than we have differences. Even though our languages might be different, our cultures are maybe different, we might have a lot in common as well, especially when we realize we have the same opponent, the United States federal government, right? And so that's the context for this book and what it's trying to do. What it's trying to reach out to kind of center the Sioux or the Lakota people, but it was meant to be read widely among lots of indigenous people or anyone who cares about these issues, and to help them develop their thought to be attuned to the moment. So with that, we can turn back to the chapter, Anthropologists and Other Friends. Now, if you notice, this book, this chapter is very sarcastic, right? That's part of Vine Deloria Jr.'s style, but also it's necessary. He's mocking anthropologists, the way he starts off saying that every summer they come. He's talking about them the way they write about Native American people, right? They come every summer and they have battle cries and all that kind of stuff like that. Like, he's playing around with the language of how they talk about Native American people as if they're not regular people with lives, problems, watching TV, just like everybody else, you know? And he says that's part of the problem, right? Is that he says one thing he says is that if the Native American people had a choice whether they should focus their fight against like the soldiers or the anthropologists, they would have fought against the anthropologists, but they didn't know because anthropology came a bit later and they didn't know what to do about that. But that's a joke in a certain sense because obviously you're going to fight the warriors trying to fight you. But in another sense, what he means is that the Native American people have lost control of their identity. They've lost control of defining for themselves what it means to be human on this world. They've lost control of themselves of what their history means. Now he says if you can walk around a community, you can ask somebody, and they're going to tell you what someone from Harvard or Yale said about them, rather than their own life and history that they've been living with. And people in Congress, because Deloria was a political active person. When I go to Congress, I'm on committees and Dakotas, and when I go to the federal organization of things, it's the anthropologists who have all the say, not even the indigenous people. They don't ask them, what do you need? What's going on? Why are you suffering? Why are you in poverty? Why are you, right? Because then the issues become too clear. Obviously, because you guys systematically refused to give us anything. You gave the best land to white settlers, and you never recompensated us, and you don't give us anything. And we're super economically vulnerable. So anytime anything bad happens, America gets rocked, but then we get hurt even harder, and it takes us longer to recover, and then more things just keep happening, right? And we need to organize ourselves differently. Because like, the United States federal government doesn't want to hear that. They want to hear that these people need to be civilized and modernized and need to be saved. So anthropologists become these figures who come, and he says they make observations. The idea is that they're supposedly neutral observers, but in reality, they only come to confirm or disconfirm other theories by anthropologists, right? These are people who don't seriously engage with the reality of Native American peoples and what's happening, what's going on from them. And furthermore, because of tourism and the cultural ethos, they also are encouraged to, like a lot of Americans, we want to see those traditional dances and we want the mask and the headdress and the feathers and all that stuff. That's what we want to know. Well, that's what we want to see when we go out there. So we encourage them to focus on those things in order to make money, right? And so the people continue to lose their autonomy, right? Now, what is to be done about that, right? Well, there's a few things. There's a few things. One is, of course, seeing what's happening for what it is. There's a real question of authority. Who should be listened to about who they are? Does a Yale anthropologist know more about indigenous community than an elder or a council of elders? That's the tension, right? Those council of elders may not have gone to college, whereas the anthropologist might be from Yale, Princeton, Columbia, University of Illinois, all these institutions, right? Who has the authority to say what over whom? And so Deloria goes through this whole story of saying that these anthropologists are debating, oh, they're bicultural, oh, they're folk people, and none of those things have anything to do with really what's really happening to indigenous people. But he says the most difficult thing is that a lot of indigenous people begin to believe it as well. So it's the process of how someone else's theory about you influences your mind. And I want you to think about that, right? Social media, other places, a lot of people are telling you what's good about you and what's bad about you, right? There's often plenty of, I'm sure many of you go on social media and you see something or someone says something and you feel bad about yourself. Someone asserts what's good or what's beautiful or what's uh, proper or anything like that, and you feel bad about yourself in a certain sense. And you have to ask, well, maybe I should investigate that, right? Where's that perspective coming from? Is it good for me? Should I spend my energy on what someone else says just because of the authority of the media, right? Should I just follow that? Or should I do something else? This is part of what environmental lawyer is encouraging the people, right? But he also says that indigenous people, as I said, that indigenous people themselves buy into these ideas because they come from very authoritative sources, right? So if a book from Harvard or Yale says that you are bicultural, you're a warriors without weapons. That's the one he says toward the end. Like that's what they're saying. He's from the Lakota. He's like, they said that we were warriors without weapons, right? And that's why we're struggling because we need to fight, we need to be hunt and do it, and we can't do it anymore, right? And he says people actually believe that. Like he says it's comforting to be told that you need to be you just need someone to do something for you, or that there's nothing you can do about your situation, or that some other entity is going to take care of you and do what they need to do for you, right? But this disempowers you, right? Right? The people in power are not invested in Native American people flourishing. They want to be managing them, essentially, right? And so for him, he's like, that stuff really makes no sense to me. It's we're not warriors without weapons. We've been struck by policies. I can point to the policies. I can point to the history. I can point to the things that have made it so that we've lost our ability to be functional economically and culturally, right? It's not because we can't fight no more and now our ceremonies of manhood were based on becoming a warrior and now we can't become warriors, right? But as I said before, there are many indigenous people that want to believe that because it makes it easier to cope, right? Or the authority of the institutions becomes more important to Native American people than their own autonomy. And so him, along with the Black Power movement and feminist movement, right, is a part of this movement towards self-determination. I want to assert myself for who I am. I want to achieve certain things in the world, and I want to embrace the truth. Right? He talks about the millions of dollars that are spent on grants to fund anthropologists writing books and doing research. He says, what if they gave that money to us? We could do so much. We can do so much with that money instead of having a book written about us, so that that person can go back and get more money to study us again. Right? So so that's one of the first things is to rethink, to reorganize your mind, to look at really what's around you and try to build capacity from there. To not be afraid to say, hey, I disagree with certain established authorities because they're encouraging my suffering. The information they produce, they've had decades to help me out, and they haven't, right? All their books, all their debates haven't made my life better in a very tangible way, right? He talks about other people in Arizona. He says those people, they're just concerned. He says the ones who have an anthropologist, had anthropologists all in their area, they seem to be doing better than us, who have the ones who do have anthropologists all over us. So clearly, anthropologists don't help a whole lot. They just he talks about this. He uses metaphors of being buried under observations, buried under written pages, buried under grant proposals, buried over all this information about you that kind of scrambles your brain, right? And so that's why I wanted to bring it back to that first question that I asked, which is what to think about what responsibilities do people have when studying humans, right? Now, it might make sense that physics can be politically neutral, that you can just explore a quark or a particle, and it doesn't matter what your observations are, what you say, it's just competing theories. But perhaps there's an error in the modern human sciences, right? Perhaps there's an error in saying that you can study humans without there being political consequences, without taking sides in your observations. Maybe there is no neutrality when it comes to observing other human people. This is a question, right? Even with the natural sciences, there are many scientists who say that climate change is at least proving that science can't be a neutral party. Whether you're for or against it, you have to take a certain kind of, whether you're for certain social changes or against them, you kind of have to make a political stance or a moral stance. And that might be a change in what it means to do sciences in the realm of life and humanity. As I said, maybe physics is still in that space where it can be more neutral. But for the sciences of life and climate and environment and human sciences, there might have to be inherent political or moral qualities to it. And this is not to say that there's a particular stance that's right, but science has tried to sidestep that, that stances are involved at all, right? So, with that said, Vine Deloria Jr. is saying, yeah, we gotta. These people are they work. They stand for the government. They're part of the established federal government, which is not invested in helping indigenous people flourish. We kind of have to take control of our own life, right? And to add another point of when he talks about indigenous people buying into it, he talks a lot about youth, right? That a lot of anthropologists come and interview young people, and he says it's kind of he says ironically even if you're going to accept the authority of the anthropologist, so you say, hey, you got a PhD at Yale, you learn all this techniques and training, all this stuff like that. Okay, let's say we accept that you know that truth and you are credentialed enough to speak about us. Then you come and talk to like teenagers about this, and then you ask them what their opinion is. And he says, what do they really know? Right? Would you accept the teenager in your community telling some other authority about what's going on in your neighborhood or your nation, right? So that idea is that, and then the young people, then they feel empowered, but then they also start to buy into the perspective more because they feel like they're contributing to it. They don't see how they are just buying into the ideology of the dominant state more, right? So he wants to try to get indigenous people to wake up, to understand that the assertion of their humanity is not going to be found in libraries. The assertion of their humanity is going to be found in political action. And to say that, hey, look, a lot of your previous policies, they aren't working. We're going to determine for ourselves what our lives mean. We're going to determine for ourselves what our own values are, right? And that all the work you've been doing as anthropologists is not neutral. It only serves to reinforce our oppression, right? And therefore, we're going to change our relationship to anthropology. So, to close up, I want you to think about a couple of things that as you maybe go back to the text, or if you haven't read it yet, to think about where's your stance on what the role of sciences, their authority should be, right? Can people just accept or reject whatever scientists come to consensus about? Because that's exactly the crisis that we're at now, right? Where there is a previous notion that science is kind of objective and neutral. It presents information, and then political and cultural leaders do what they want with it. But now, with issues such as climate change and clearly issues in the United States, issues around gender and race, specifically. There's other ones, but those ones don't seem to be as salient. There's a lot of tension now. Even though science might be in consensus about what certain things mean, large groups of people disagree, right? And is this disagreement a good thing? Because most people would say that if someone disagreed about certain things about physics, people would be like, "There's wrong. That person's just wrong," right? If someone says, "There's no law of thermodynamics. I don't believe in it." A lot of people say that person is wrong, and they shouldn't be teaching people about that. But when it comes to things like race or gender or environmental issues or some other things, there's a lot of more attention about that. And it's not to say that any perspective is particularly right or wrong, but just what do you think about the fact that there's that tension there? Is it as simple as, well, there's a huge portion of the world, or sorry, of the population in the United States, for instance, that's just wrong? Or is it the idea that people should be able to believe what they want, even if it disagrees with scientific consensus? But then where do you draw the line, right? What's so great about the scientific method, right? One of the reasons why we center the scientific method so much is because we believe that it gives this really great truth that perhaps even is objective. But there seems to be something that changes when it comes to human beings, right? And so I want you to think about, where do you stand in relation to that, right? And why, right? Why do you think that perhaps some scientific facts should be accepted and some shouldn't? What's unique about the human? That's what a lot is leading up to, right? What's unique about the human that even if all the scientists come to consensus, if 10 million people disagree with them, that's fine. But if 10 million people disagreed about what electricity did, people would feel like, wow, there's something really bad going on there, right? And with Vine Deloria Jr., I hope to understand that this question has immense political significance. It already did 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and it's only continued to gain relevance now. All right.